So I think it's been close to 20 years ago that I would often teach a intro to sociology class, particularly and would start that class, particularly on the section in which we talked about sociology of religion. I would start the class by simply putting 3 words on the board. Now, you can tell it was over 20 years ago because I used a board. But I wrote the words Muslim, Buddhist, Christian. And then I asked the students, I wanted them to share with the class some descriptors of what those words or who those people were. Some descriptions. And under Muslim, not surprising, a number of them shouted out Arab, which is really not true. Most Muslims are not of Arabic nature, but from other nationalities. What are some other descriptions you think they would lift up? Go ahead, you can say. Would you be surprised? Terrorist. That's right, Ann. Terrorist was a common one, and again, not necessarily accurate, as most Muslims are not terrorists. Buddhists usually confuse them. They would say things like Asian or meditation or bald heads was often a common descriptor, is what they would do. So what do you think, when I had Christian up there, the most common descriptions they were? Exactly right, Barb. What'd you say? Judgmental. What else do you think they had when describing Christians? Judgmental, anti-science, literal. Which these are young people in Oklahoma, many of them who would identify as Christian, but more often than not, that was the words they used to describe Christian. And what has always struck me about that exercise was how people of faith, or how faith itself was understood by these young people, more often than not, in negative terms. And there is a conundrum for us, many of us who identify ourselves as people of faith, particularly of the Christian faith, that on the one hand, there are those who are very public, very loud, very distinctive about their claims of Christian faith, that I can only describe what I call disvangelical, the opposite of good news, dystopian, authoritarianism. And on the other side, there are those who reject faith altogether as a way of being in the world, maybe in part because of the disevangelicals describing themselves as nuns. Have you ever heard that term before? This is whenever one is taking a survey and they mark under religion, they mark none. Did you know that's the fastest growing group in the religious landscape of our country? Those claiming to have no faith. So faith is a loaded word for us these days, and yet I would still hold that it is a vital and important word we should wrestle with together. So this morning, I want us to talk about faith. Try to understand what we mean by that. It's a word we take for granted. It's a word we throw around in church a lot, in many ways implying we think most people understand what we mean by faith. What is faith? And what do we mean ourselves to describe ourselves as people of faith? Now, I think this question isn't simply an intellectual exercise. I would argue it's not only important for those of us who are part of the community called the church, but for our whole society today. And part of the reason I think that, because I look at the world around me, in a world where the military patrols major cities in our country, where people are taken off the street without due process because they may be undocumented, more likely because their skin is brown, where our safety nets have been stripped away for most vulnerable people, where mass shootings occur weekly. Loss of faith, whether it is in God or the future or in democracy or in our capacity to create a more just and peaceful world, is a challenging issue. Have we lost faith? Now, for a lot of people, faith is defined and associated with a kind of strong belief in certain doctrines or statements about God. To be a person of faith means to believe things, to adhere to those beliefs, no matter whether it might be the literal interpretation of the Bible or the virgin birth. Faith is understood as a kind of intellectual assent about God, about Christ, as illustrated by those who argue that what you believe in, you have to believe in these certain things. Now, don't get me wrong, what we believe about God matters, but that's not necessarily what it means to be people of faith. Faith is not simply an intellectual idea, an act of the mind, but something deeper, something more powerful, something more truthful. The definition of faith is best defined by the Greek word that shows up whenever that word shows up, belief and faith in the Gospels. And it means something not simply intellectual, but something involving the heart and mind and soul. It means trust. Faith is a complete trust in God or in someone or something. And the trust is more than a belief, it is a way of living each and every day. As Paul put it, a way of living in the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It's trusting that God is at work in our lives and in the world, even when, especially when, it's really hard to see. And let's confess, it's hard to see these days, isn't it? Now, it strikes me in these two very short passages about faith, Jesus uses the image of seeds. Have you ever seen a mustard seed? It's almost impossible to see, to describe faith. In the parable about God's kingdom or kingdom, God's presence, God's Spirit is like this mustard seed, the smallest of such seeds that grows into the greatest of shrubs, grows into a tree where the birds of the air, this beautiful image, the birds of the air find shelter and safety. In other words, no matter how small the seed of God's activity, believe, trust, faith will grow. And then in the very verse that I read afterwards, in your faith, your trust, and what strikes me about this text, rather than the claim about that I can tell the mountain to move from here to there, that's rather an exaggeration, I'm sure Jesus making a point. But the interesting point to me is Jesus describes a faith that's so tiny, it's hard to see. In other words, even if your faith is so tiny you have to dig around in there to find it, even that faith can move mountains. Think about that. It's not that we have to have this huge blazing faith. It's not that we don't have doubts, not that we don't struggle. It's not that we don't struggle to see God in the world or to trust God when things are challenging, both personally and society. God will use whatever tiny glimmer of a mustard seed of faith you have to move mountains. Even that small seed of faith that we must confess some days better than others, even that small seed is used by God to move mountains. So if we talk about ourselves as people of faith, as a people who trust that no matter how small or how hard it is to see the seeds of God's Spirit, the seeds of God's reality and kingdom around us, God is at work. Even here, even in this time. And I see those seeds, and I'm going to brag on this congregation a little bit. I see those seeds in this community of faith, in the refugee ministry, with our families. Small seeds of faith, of kindness and caring and support. Small things like going to soccer games. Small things like teaching a Sunday school at First Arabic. Small things like holding the hands of a refugee mother giving birth. Those are seeds. I see the mustard seeds of faith in a number of our members, particularly two of our members who dreamed of feeding children this summer. Frustrated that the state of Iowa had decided they were not going to support and give food to children and youth. Two of our members, with the help of the mission committee, they doubted themselves. They struggled. That's too big a job. Started with that seed of faith and trusted God would work and gave food to so many families, as well as some children's books. They moved mountains, right? And I see faith, the mustard seeds of those who stand up for, speak for the vulnerable, the poor, who make phone calls, who announce to the world, like we do in our sign, that everyone is welcome in our society. That's not a big thing. That's a small mustard seed of faith, yet it makes a difference. That's how God changes the world. So have faith, no matter how small. One of the best examples of this I just saw this week, someone shared a video of the Edward, I'm going to get this right, the Edward Said Conservatory in Gaza City. It was founded 13 years ago. And the video shows in this bombed out building, destroyed building, these young people playing musical instruments and making music. It showed teachers going out into the refugee camps, teaching kids to play guitars, to beat on drums. And many of their instruments were destroyed, many of their students were killed, but they still teach and make music. In Gaza City. Amidst the ruin, these young people play beautiful music with borrowed instruments actually made from the wreckage itself. That's an act of faith. small, minuscule in the face of war and the bigness of the world around us. But they have faith that one day will grow into a great tree providing shelter and safety to all. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.